this okay?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, good morning. The bulk of my research centers on the role of Finzi's music within the so-called English musical Renaissance, a musical and nationalistic movement from roughly 1850 to 1950 that sought to establish a characteristically English sound in musical composition. My work argues that Finzi's music achieved the aesthetic ideals of this movement. Finzi himself was not a nationalistic composer by the standard convention. He thrived in provincial life, was extremely modest about his abilities, and held strong pacifist convictions during the wars. This talk, however, focuses on a different aspect of Finzi's life. The title of this presentation is Dear Seti, Discovering Gerald Finzi Through His Correspondence with St. Andrew's Master of Music, Cedric Thorpe Davy. In this talk, I hope to paint a more personal and altogether different picture of Finzi the man, and in so doing, the music. In preparation for this talk, I thought at several pivotal moments of renaming it to Letters from Gerald, Discovering Cedric Thorpe Davy through his correspondence with the underrated English composer Gerald Finzi. For indeed, in the reading of the 249 letters from Finzi to Thorpe Davy, which spanned 23 years, I discovered just as much about Professor Davy than Finzi. We begin, oh, that was the previous slide. We begin with a letter from 1933, when Finzi was 32 years old and Thorpe Davy was only 20. At the time, the young Cedric was still a student at the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama in Glasgow. In this first letter, Finzi writes, quote, "You're quite right in saying that I don't give a damn what the key is, always supposing that it's satisfactorily done and provides the contrast." A frequent criticism of Finzi's music is his unconventional way of modulating, which can sometimes seem unpredictable or unexpected, but often for rhetorical effect. Next, I'd like to look at a July 12th, 1933 letter in order to help situate the importance of analyzing these letters. Finzi wrote, quote, "It looks as if destiny had forged in you a tool through which my musical education is going to be completed, though I hadn't expected it in this life." This is high and weighty praise from Finzi to a composer who was only 20 years old, 13 years his junior, and indicative of the scrutinizing and immense musical prowess that Finzi thought Thorpe Davy to possess. Music historians are rightfully very interested in the close interpersonal relationships that a composer has during his or her lifetime. Whether platonic or romantic, relationships matter because it influences and colors the person, thereby inevitably affecting the art that is produced. An example I very much like that shows the casual side of their friendship, which I know that Diana McVeigh touched on as well in her talk, is a January 18th, 1937 letter where Thorpe Davy is about to be married to Margaret Russell Brown, hereafter referred to by her nickname Bruno. In regards to wedding gifts and some advice, Finzi writes, "What for the home?" Joy, Finzi's wife, likes supplying Pyrex dishes and sensible things for the kitchen, about which there can be no aesthetic disputes. Then there are books and music, and we could always send you a glass or china ornament, which you could give away to your chief enemy when he gets married. It is a source of great joy to learn that Finzi was more than just a producer of melodies of ineffable lyricism, but that he had a great sense of humor and Pyrex dishes in his home. Finzi held strong pacifist views, and the great European conflicts in the first half of the 20th century had a profound impact on him, and, as we see in this letter, on his compositions. War-inflicted emotional turmoil was formative for Finzi. His first composition teacher and friend, Ernest Farrar, died at the front just 2 weeks before the World War I armistice, having only been there for 2 days. During the Second World War, Finzi worked for the Ministry of War Transport in England, a job that he obviously detested, but perhaps a saving grace was that he was able to lodge German and Czech refugees in his home. In a March 11th, 1945 letter, Finzi writes to Davy, quote, how I agree with you about the duty value of these things having gone. Unbelievable nuisance, and there he's quoting Thorpe Davy, is putting it too mildly. I particularly resent it because most of my work has reoriented itself to a post-war direction, and I feel very strongly that my own post-war work is more necessary than putting the shipping lines on the map again or feathering the nests of wealthy ship owners. This is an important piece of primary source material. There is something to be said about a composer's role in a time of war. Musical commentary about the injustice and disdain for war can be seen throughout music history, from Haydn's Mass in a Time of War to the War Requiem by another famous English pacifist, Benjamin Britten. There are several theories on why reception history does not consider Finzi to be part of the super league of English national composers, a list that is presented in Robert Stradling and Marion Hughes's seminal work on the movement. And the reasons range from his Jewishness, the Finzis were a prominent Sephardic Jewish family from Italy, to his choice of leading a very provincial life. Although Finzi did teach at the Royal Academy of Music in London, he resigned after only 2 years because he hated the thought of living in the city. Another reason is that Finzi detested war and was an ardent pacifist. And how can you be a composer of national music in an era of wars if you don't approve of war? I conjecture one might write music, revitalizing and synthesizing anachronistic musical styles unique to your nation to comment on not supporting inhumane violence, thereby affirming your country's transparent ideal for peace and goodwill. And that's what Finzi did. On the last page of the same letter, Finzi writes, quote, "Boozy and Hawks have just published an old thing of mine, Farewell to Arms, on the subject of swords into plowshares. And I've just sent a copy to my chief, saying that it's an unusual but perhaps more interesting way of giving notice." Written in a Baroque recitative aria form, this old thing, Farewell to Arms, Opus 9, uses 2 poems by the 16th century dramatist and poet George Peele and the 17th century pastor poet Ralph Nevitt, which Finzi set 20 years apart. This work exemplifies Finzi's pacifist views, drawn from his contempt, rage, and sorrow over both world wars. The addition of the recitative in 1944 to the existing Peele aria text, which was set in the 1920s, shows how much Finzi opposed the brutality in human nature. The veteran soldier relinquishing his sword, the helmet now and high for bees becomes, the unarmed soldier. Finzi set Nevitt's texts as supplications, and it is truly one of the most affecting works in his entire output. Let's listen now to the 8-bar introduction to this aria. Now, presenting, albeit virtually, in St. Andrews, it's only right that I include some bits about St. Andrews, which again, I know that Diana has done. This September 14th, 1945 letter remarks on Thorpe Davy being granted the post of Master of Music here at the university. Dear SETI, I was very delighted to hear from Howard that you have got St. Andrews, and I hope that means the end to any financial trouble and much more scope for music making. I hope Bruno is pleased with the news. I don't know St. Andrews, but I'm told it's a lovely place. Perhaps we shall be able to come and see you there one day. Isn't it marvelous to be free again? Indeed, this letter comes only 12 days after the official end date of World War II, which resulted in a very fruitful time of musical composition and performance for both composers. The next letter I'd like to discuss is a golden nugget of musical insight, dated November 11th, 1946. Now, reading letters is a lot like digging for diamonds in the sand. You have to sift through a lot of seemingly endless pleasantries about family life and which train should I catch to Lucas. But this letter is one such diamond, as it informs not only Finzi scholarship, but the historiographical studies and fundamental tenets of the English musical Renaissance. In this letter, Finzi talks about the importance of Thomas Arne, an 18th century English composer whose impact on English musical life has been watered down to simply being the composer of Rule Britannia. Finzi discusses Arne's keyboard concertos, writing, quote, "I have always been on the lookout for works for solo instruments and strings. As you know, one gets dreadfully fed up with the inevitable half-dozen concertos which one has to trot out season after season and year after year." He continues to say that he only became acquainted with the concertos after rereading Hubert Langley's book on Arne, published in 1938, which is still within the traditional time frame and date posts of the English musical Renaissance. Finzi was very much taken with Concerto No. 5, which he found was unpublished, but that a Julian Herbert edition was available for hire. He then led what seems to be a one-man band in the advancement of these works, using his connections and network base to get instrumental parts made for many of the concerti for which only piano reductions were at the time available. Thorpe Davy offered to help with this endeavor, with Finzi noting, quote, I think you would do it better than she or I." Finzi was referring to the pianist Ruth Dyson, whom he had hired to perform the Fifth Concerto, most likely with his chamber group, the Newberry String Players. Upon delving further into the life of these concertos, I discovered that they have since been recorded several times, including a rather famous recording by the English consort with Trevor Pinnock as the harpsichord soloist. As we will see from later letters, Thorpe Davy was highly instrumental in this edition process, which was from the start spearheaded by Finzi. In 1968, the Musical Times critic Robert Anderson wrote about a performance of Arne's Concerto No. 5, quote, "His melodies are fresh, and even the fugue in the overture sounds as if it has come up from the country for the occasion." While this observation may come across as commonplace to the general public or banal to the music scholar, for us who do work on the EMR and on English national music, this is a very important piece of reception history. Here we have a Times critic saying that the music of an 18th century English composer sonically represented the English countryside. As you probably know, one of the quintessential aesthetic traits of music embodying the ideals of the English musical Renaissance was pastoralism, a musical depiction of England's green and pleasant lands famously coined by William Blake in the 19th century. Scholars generally agree that this was achieved through synthesis and revitalization of folk song and through timbral textures of vastness and expanse, especially in string and woodwind instruments. Writing. These hallmarks of the movement are generally known as the English sound. Finzi, while not interested in any national fame or recognition, was very much interested in cultivating this English sound. And my first article strongly asserted that Finzi's compositions are the quintessential examples of the English sound through the aesthetic mastery of the revitalization and synthesis of the aforementioned anachronistic forms, with the addition of Tudor polyphony and modal harmony. That is why I am not at all surprised that it was Finzi who saw that an English composer from the 1700s began to incorporate these elements in composition at a time when musical production in England was beginning to stagnate. Being an active conductor, Finzi programmed and thereby advocated for Arne's concertos. Somewhat fancifully, I like to believe it was the reason for most, if not all, of the later success these concertos had in the following decades. Finzi continues, "In the last few years, I have rather changed my mind about a lot of the 18th century stuff, William Boyce and Arne in particular, and feel that we have been viewing the scene from the wrong hillock, if you know what I mean. So although I don't think they are great works, and are the bogus cello Haydn and Boccherini great works. Once one gets back to their idiom and background, I think they are extremely delightful works, in the same way that the Haydn D major piano concerto is delightful. It is precisely this idiomatic style and background that EMR composers try to observe when looking back and drawing inspiration from Tudor composers, and it would truly be disingenuous to not actively survey all of the composers since Tallis and Bird, which Finzi did so masterfully. Despite the previously mentioned detail about Finzi's brief stint teaching at the Royal Academy of Music, we don't often think of Finzi as a teacher. And given the high station Thorpe Davy was given as professor at the university, how much Cedric learned from Finzi. This January 6, 1947 letter is a wonderful look into Finzi's critical and pedagogical eye, as he offers Thorpe Davy some rather pointed suggestions on the Arne concerto editions, writing in a tone one might expect an advisor to use when addressing his or her doctoral student. I know that Diana earlier commented that he could be rather exacting. Some of my favorites. Quote, about ornaments. For heaven's sake, don't say a moment's consideration will determine which is intended in each individual instance. On his cadenzas, Finzi writes, quote, I should never dare to compete with you in extemporary playing, but I think your little flourish is just a wee bit too bald, and have written in pencil a suggestive alternative for you to steal if so inclined. And perhaps the best one, quote, your language about cues offends my ears, because oboes can't be omitted simply. I should suggest, quote, if necessary, the oboes may be omitted. Now, to leave poor Davy alone for a moment, this little bit about writing for the organ is humorous to read for any lover of Finzi. Quote, I am too ignorant about that damnable instrument to know whether they could be played nowadays on the organ. The reason why this is so humorous is because it is so quintessentially Finzi, always self-deprecating and never worthy of such diminutive self-assessment. One need only listen to his anthem, Lo, the Full Final Sacrifice, a staple of the Anglican choral canon that Thorpe Davy performed with St. Salvator's Chapel Choir on several occasions, to recognize that not only was Finzi not ignorant about the organ, but he had aptitude and intuition in spades in writing for that, quote, damnable instrument. Finzi ends his letter with, I'm sure, a much welcomed compliment. How on earth you managed to discover that mysterious part from the Nicolai concerto is beyond me. Have you an index or a good nose? Was it chance or genius? Your scent for these things is so remarkable that I feel you must have a system. An important part of my research is the analysis of Finzi's songs. There have been several extraordinary composers who have written exquisite songs, but no English composer between 1815 and 1950 harmonically treated the lyrical nature of the folk song with the language of neo-Tudor free polyphony in the piano the way Finzi did. In this letter from October 3rd, 1948, we are privileged to see Finzi's thoughts on several songs that Thorpe Davy had composed and sent to him. In his commentary on Seti's songs, we see evidence that the ultimate strength in Finzi's songwriting was his innate skill at melody and declamation. About the actual setting of words, he writes, this seems absolutely satisfactory and most sensitive. Personally, I have no theories about the matter. It comes just natural-like, and I can't see why a melodic line should not be just as beautiful with a decent actuation as without. If it were a question of sacrificing the music to verbal accentuation, I shouldn't hesitate to be on the side of the music, but I have never in my life found it necessary, and I think these songs show you haven't either. It was exactly this gift of never needing to compromise between the integrity of the music and the integrity of the text that makes Finzi's vocal writing singularly unique in setting English poetry. Creating informed and performative musical editions are often the mark of great musical minds, as it requires technical mastery, historical knowledge, and a thirst for quality and extremely meticulous work. Music editing was the province of many accomplished composers of the EMR, such as Vaughan Williams, who edited the hymnal for the Church of England that resulted in the English hymnal of 1906. Finzi was keenly aware of the unique talents it took to be a music editor, which makes his urging of Thorpe Davey to edit a body of concertos he thought to be so important a huge nod to Davey's skill. Although ever critical of his own skill, Finzi was indeed more than capable of such a task, and I was pleased to discover that he did engage in professional music editing, such as these John Stanley concertos he mentions in this 1950 letter from January 9th. Here he asks Davey for his opinion on editorial methods, quote, especially as I'm hoping to get another 2 or 3 out of them out. Finzi's Stanley editions are still in print for sale by Boosey and Hawkes, and I particularly enjoyed what the Boosey and Hawkes website wrote about Finzi on the listing for his edition of Stanley Concertos No. 5. It's really so perfect, and I do wonder if Diana McVeigh has written this. I have not asked her, but I wonder if she did. Finzi was an artist highly cultivated in a range of interests, whether it be the collecting of English literature, the saving from extinction of rare varieties of apple, or the promotion of composers, dead and living, who he considered to be neglected. He threw himself heart and soul into the task. With music, this enthusiasm resulted in a number of arrangements and performing editions which remain, as much as ever, of practical use and interest, while also serving as testimony to Finzi's energy and vision. This next bit is mightily interesting for the history of the music department here at St. Andrews. Beginning in 1951, the letters concern Thorpe Davey's request that Finzi be hired to write the final examinations for the music students at the university. Finzi agreed, and for 3 years wrote the final comprehensive exams to be taken by those who read music at the university. There is perhaps no better means of evaluating a composer's thoughts on music than reading the exams he wrote to evaluate students of music. It seems that SETI did some probing first, asking Gerald what his repertory suggestions would be for first-year music students in an October 27, 1951 letter. Among others, Finzi thought that these students should know J.S. Bach's Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor, the Verdi Requiem, saying, quote, "It seems rather a giant for them to digest, but they've got to know it sooner or later. Contemporary works and other canonic works from Sibelius to Bartók String Quartet No. 1. This shows what broad interests and influences Finzi had, and it is no wonder that Thorpe Davey would ask him to write up the final examinations. Davey must have felt that passing a music examination written by Finzi would make one worthy of having read music at St. Andrews. And it is a small but highly significant detail in the reception of Finzi the man and the music. Now, it is archival gold, really, that Davey kept all the sample exam questions that Finzi sent to him. I know that there are people here who are eager to know what some of these final exam questions were, and I'm happy to indulge by sharing a few. Quote, "Compose the principles upon which the first movements of Bach's and Mozart's are constructed. Unfortunately, we don't know from what pieces. Quote subject matter from both works in illustration of your answer. Next, give your views on the question of whether some or all or none of the songs in Schubert's Die Schöne Müllerin are suitable for public performance, apart from their context in the complete cycle. Next, name 2 characteristic details of Schubert's harmonic idiom and quote or refer precisely to at least 2 instances of each in Die Schöne Müllerin. Write a short but comprehensive essay upon the destiny of opera from Jacopo Peri to Debussy, making special reference to each of the various attempts at reform. Mention no fewer than 12 composers of at least 4 nationalities, and refer wherever suitable to specific operas by name. Distinguish between 1. Recitative secco, 2. Da capo aria, and 3. Lied. And the last one I'm going to share, although there are many more, is probably my favorite from the first set. Quote, Symphony number 4. Name 8 composers who have written one of these. If you're anything like me, you can gradually name about 6, and then you begin to do the glorified survey of Western music in your head. As a related and humorous aside, Finzi writes in a follow-up letter on the exam questions, quote, Am I being too kind or too unkind? Considering Finzi wrote the exams for the next 3 years, I think we can safely say that his high expectations never crossed over into unfairness. We know that Finzi held strong pacifist views and that this was reflected in his post-war writing. In a June 6, 1955 letter, we discover that this really hit close to home in another way, when his own son, Christopher or Kiffer, was imprisoned for pacifism when he refused to do his national service. About Christopher. He has been in a very tough prison, Lewis, all under 21 and serving anything up to 5 years. Joy and Nigel went down to see him. He was very brown with pick and shovel work out of doors and had lost about 2 stone, as he maintains his veg diet, and that means he only gets white bread and tea. The types are such that he says one is very glad to have a warder always present. But he has his own cell, and in the last 3 weeks has been allowed music and manuscript paper, which has made things much better. His sentence expires next Saturday. How I wish a few more people had his guts. The last line moved me, as I cannot help but think that it was colored with tinges of guilt for not being as brave as his own son. During the Second World War, Finzi had a wife and 2 children to support. An outright refusal of supporting the war effort during the conflict would have not only ruined all chances of Finzi having any type of reputable career, but would have left Joy and the boys alone and struggling. Going further, drawing upon analysis done in my doctoral dissertation on Finzi's Jewishness being a prominent factor in the less than enthusiastic reception of Finzi's music during his lifetime, the last line in this letter also illuminates that Finzi was very much cognizant his entire life of not going to such an extreme as to make it impossible for him to fully assimilate into society. Thorpe Davey was hired as Master of Music at St. Andrews right after the Second World War and was raised to full Professor of Music in 1973. In a January 11, 1956 letter, however, we find out that he was considering taking a position in Glasgow and leaving St. Andrews. Quote, and this is Finzi writing, "The Glasgow question must be a difficult one. Personally, I should find it not worthwhile to leave so lovely a place as St. Andrews. Against that, the musical scope in Glasgow would be so much greater, which seems to me even more important than the 2,100 pounds. And with the boys soon to be both away from home, it might not be so bad. But oh, Glasgow air compared with St. Andrews. Oh, Glasgow air compared with St. Andrews indeed. However seriously Davy was considering the life move, I think it suffices to say that we are grateful that he didn't leave. Finzi died just a few months after sending that letter, and I wonder how much his words affected Davy's thought process over this decision. At the very least, I think we can agree that the music department owes Finzi a tiny nod of thanks for encouraging Thorpe Davey to stay. The final letter. The last letter Finzi wrote to Davy was on September 20th, 1956, just 7 days before Finzi died at age 55 from complications due to shingles and having a rare form of blood cancer. Finzi's final remarks to Davy were on Wagner, A somewhat interesting famous last words, considering Finzi came from a prominent Jewish family, although Finzi never really identified with his heritage. His words, though, speak volumes on the unbiased nature of his musical assessment. No, of course, I don't think most Wagner is in the same category as the other two. In a previous letter, Finzi had expressed dislike for the music of Berlioz and Weber. He, Wagner, created an extraordinarily individual musical context. And even if one dislikes the qualities of his mind, which exude through every bar, one can't escape the greatness, the sheer intellectual force, combined with emotional force, of nearly all his later works. The fact that he used a large harmonic unit, rather as Sibelius does, doesn't lessen him in my eyes. But when Bruckner uses a similar unit, the music can't stand up to it. Now, I love these words from Finzi. They were some of the last, if the last, he ever wrote. And they were words of genuine praise and admiration of the music of someone who, as a person, he detested. Quintessentially Finzi. Strong opinions, but to give credit where credit was due. Now, a brief quasi-secular, if you will, and closing remarks. Since we saw a video from Diana McVeigh before this, I wanted to share. The last letter I'd like to share is from 1955, which breaks the strictly chronological sequence thus far, but only by a year. Quote, incidentally, the new Diana McVeigh book on Elgar is first rate. She's a new name to me and must be young, but she really has more acumen than most of the little pipsqueaks who write musical criticism. I wish she would do one on Perry. Now, Diana McVeigh, who was not yet 30 when her now classic book, Edward Elgar, His Life and Music, was published in 1955. While Diana never wrote one on Perry, she did write one on the man who wrote this letter. In 2005, almost exactly 50 years later, her book, Gerald Finzi, His Life and Music, was published and is now, along with Stephen Banfield's text, considered the staple reference for any of us who do work on Finzi, myself included. I am not ashamed to say that Finzi was my musical salvation, and I am most grateful to Cedric Thorpe Davy for bringing me one step closer to understanding more fully the complexities of this incredible human, whose music continues to accompany my days and whose songs sing my joy. Thank you very much.